Welcome to part 3 of this mini-series about Flamingo Land history. This time we're talking about the 90s. Before we start, this guy, this light, many of you commented on it being distracting. I had filmed all 5 episodes. I am filming it again because, as you can see, I fixed it. Although now this is broken, so that doesn't help. Anyway, let's get going with the 90s. Right, we start off 1990. Now again, as I said in the previous episode, because quite a few of you commented about that I got the dates wrong, I have tried to cross-reference as much as possible. There is a lot of conflicting information out there, so please bear with me. Some of these might be out a little bit. But anyway, in the 90s, we started off with a Ferris wheel, which is still in the park today. Now, it's a kind of wagon wheel, wagon truck style one, currently called Rotator. And I mean, what more is there to say? It's a Ferris wheel where each of the cars looks like a wagon. If you watched the last episode, you'll know I mentioned that this park absolutely loves their transportation rides. Well, they got another one in the 90s, and I got confused by this because it's the People Mover, except it said it was removed in 2017. And I'm sitting there going, but it's still there. Well, it turns out in 2018, they got a replacement called the People Mover, or sorry, the People Mover, because it's got 2 O's. So we'll get to that later. But basically, as far as I can tell, it's the same ride, just a different train. In any case, it's the most pointless thing, because it goes from Flamingo One at one end to the Muddy Duck Farm at the other end. And it's pretty much a straight line, so don't know why they bothered. In the last episode, I mentioned their animatronics, which seem to be a kind of copy of what's in various other parks, known as the Billy Bob Show, the Rock of Fire Explosion, or something along those lines. Well, from what I can tell in the 90s, there was the Talking Chimp Show. Now, and please let me know in the comments below, I'm not sure if this was an extension of that animatronic show or a completely separate animatronic show. And it came around in the 90s. Right, I alluded in the first couple of episodes that there was going to be a special guest. He's about to come up because they got a new attraction in 1990, which, well, it's got the same name as a ride over at Towers, but I'm going to let Joe from Theme Park Insanity tell you all about it.
Now, a lot of you will have ridden the Corkscrew at Alton Towers, a real legendary, iconic staple attraction that operated, of course, at Alton Towers back in the 1980s. It was the UK's first inverting roller coaster, I believe, and Flamingo Land had an exact clone of it. Now, again, I got on this after I'd actually been on Magnum Force, so you can imagine the comparison between the two when I rode it. Regardless of that, though, this was my first experience of a classic corkscrew coaster. I've got to say, as much as it wasn't a massively big thrilling ride for me at least, I'm sure it was for a lot of people, it's one that I continued to ride over and over and over as I did go through the years up to the point when it left. But Corkscrew ultimately was one of my personal favourites of the park up until it kind of left when it did. Now, for those of you that might not know, obviously they have Sick there nowadays. And Sick is an Intamin multi-inversion roller coaster. But apparently, from what I've been told, those corkscrews you go through on Sick are as close to the original footprint of the 2 corkscrews that featured on Corkscrew back in the day. So, when you're going through those corkscrews next time, just remember, you're pretty much at that point where you went through those corkscrews on Corkscrew. A lovely little nod back to a past attraction and something very special.
Now, the park got another set of slides this year. Now, if you saw the earlier episodes, they had the rock slide. Again, set of simple slides. Nothing fancy. Well, they did it again, only this time it was clown themed. Maybe in the 90s clowns were still kid friendly? Clowns are terrifying now, right? And this next one, now some of you picked me up on this in the last episode because I mentioned a ride called Coco's Cars, which to the best of my knowledge was from the 80s. Now, some of you said no, it was from the 90s. I don't know if that's true because in the 90s, we got a ride called Professor Bubble's Seaside Adventures, which, as far as I can tell, is the same ride, re-themed. So I think maybe that's where the confusion came from. Again, listen, if I'm wrong, please do correct me, but I'm pretty sure this tracked ride was Coco's Cars, just painted green this time, and Professor Bubble's themed. And again, when I look through newspapers, now I mentioned a number of incidents in the previous episodes. Unfortunately, there was another one here, although I don't think it was actually in 1990, I think it was just they got fined in 1990, probably it was a couple of years prior. But effectively, a couple of kids were trapped in a log flume when a cable fell on top of them. Okay, so, listen, I try and put adverts in where I can find them, right? And I've got one from 1990. I mean, I'm gonna, again, show my age, which I'm sure you all know, I'm in my 40s. Anyone remember the BBC Micro? those little kind of clunky computers we used to use at school. Well, I used to use at school. Some of you probably use modern computers. But anyway, this next advert looks like it was made on a BBC Micro because the graphics are terrible.
How much fun can your family pack into a Flamingo Land holiday? Included in the cost of your luxury holiday home, there's more than 100 rides, slides and shows to enjoy again and again, all at no extra charge. There's great entertainment for all the family, all day, every day, all included at Flamingo Land Holiday Village near Scarborough. It costs nothing to ring for details.
Right, 1991, and on the back of Corkscrew the previous year, the park got another coaster. But I'm going to hand over to Joe again because, well, he's got some stories to tell.
Now, of course, one of the rides that you will all know, of course, is the Bullet. Now, this was a Schwarzkopf looping shuttle coaster, and it had quite a unique layout at the time. Sadly, this is one ride I never actually managed to get because every time I tried to get on it, it was either broken or it was down or it just wasn't working. I seemed to hit it wrong every single time. And I'm gutted because I literally watched it go round, I went and got in the line, and then again it broke down again. It had a real Alton Towers vibe from Fair, you know, like one of those where you get in the queue and something breaks and you're just really gutted about it, but I never actually managed to get on, no matter how many times I went to Flamingo Land. It's one that I regret missing out on. I'm sure it's out there somewhere. I think it's in Mexico, but I'm not 100%. But yeah, certainly one of the ones I'm most gutted about missing. It's one that I really wanted to ride as a child and sadly never got to do so.
Right, cheers for that, Joe. There's a few things you forgot to mention there, though. This ride had a few challenges. One of them was that it seemed to be making some weird noises. And the engineers took some time trying to figure out where's the squeaking noise coming from. They were like, does something need oiled? Is there something like loose? Whatever it was. Turns out there was a bird's nest in the attraction. And basically these birds were squeaking and squawking. And the solution that they had was to only operate the ride for a couple of hours a day until they'd flown the nest. So unfortunately, that probably meant you could turn up to the park and not get on the ride because of some birds. And that wasn't the biggest issue though. The biggest issue with this ride, well, I'll let this clip tell you all about it.
But despite the Bullet's popularity, Flamingo Land may now be forced to pull it down. Rydale Council says planning permission was never given, and the ride has been built 11 metres higher than the recommended level. Flamingo Land is to now lodge an appeal against the council's ruling, and an independent inspector now looks likely to make the final decision as to whether the Bullet should stay.
Right, so what's interesting about that is that the park's owner had this novel solution for the problem, and that was to build a second park and move this to it and make it the headline attraction. Now, he didn't do that. We'll get on to what he did in a minute, but that was his initial proposed plan. Right, so there was a couple of other smaller attractions added in 91, and one of these, now I've never seen this particular style of this ride, right? I've seen many of these rides. It's just a waltzer, we've all seen them. But as far as I'm aware, every waltzer I know of is a fully enclosed kind of track. I mean, obviously there's an opening at the front to get in the ride, but other than that, it's kind of dark and usually, you know, quite atmospheric, put flashing lights and maybe some smoke effects or something like that. This one is fully open all the way around, which I don't think I've ever seen. Now, maybe I'm just the odd one out, or maybe in the 90s that's what the waltzers looked like. Certainly not the travelling ones I can remember, so yeah, let me know. Right, again, sticking with this kind of copy-paste thing that I've mentioned a few times, this next ride, there was a version of this at Blackpool. I don't think it was the same one, but nonetheless there was one of these, and it was basically a flying carpet ride. Except, I mean, it was called 1001 Nights, well, sort of. So it was a German ride, and again, assuming this isn't the same one that moved to Blackpool and this was just like a number of these rides that made it to the UK, it shipped from Germany with the German name on it. So it was 1001 Nachts, something like that. But it didn't last very long, because it disappeared the following year. Right, two other attractions in 1991, and the first one wasn't much to write home about. It was a very simple teacups ride for kids, and quite a small version of it as well. Like, I'm not talking sort of Marauders Mayhem at Alton Towers, I'm just talking very, very small kids' teacups. So they added that. And then the other one that they added, well, I'm going to go back to Joe again because he once again has some memories of this one.
I'm going to talk about a ride which does get discussed very much, at least not by people kind of outside the Flamingo Land enthusiast community, and that of course is Thunder Mountain. Now no, I'm not talking about Big Thunder Mountain at Disneyland Paris, that's a whole different ride in itself and it's absolutely incredible, don't get me wrong, but this one was a indoor roller coaster inside a giant rock facade show building. Now I say rock facade because in all honesty, other than the actual ride inside, from what I remember at least, it was a roller coaster ride in the dark. So you went in, you got in the car, you thought you were going to go in and obviously have effects and things happen around you. As far as I can remember, I could be wrong, but this is my memory of it at least, nothing actually happened. It was an entire roller coaster ride in the dark. That was fun, don't get me wrong, but the one time then I actually did go on and they turned all the house lights on, that was a whole different experience. Going around seeing that inside of that rock building and actually seeing what was actually inside, it literally felt just like they plunked a roller coaster in a warehouse. But for some weird reason, Thunder Mountain rather, still gets talked about today. And there's still a lot of enthusiasts in and around the Flamingo Land community that would love to see something like that actually back at the park, but with actual theming inside. I've got to say, I would love to see the same thing myself, but at the end of the day, you know, they're moving forward in the right direction now.
Right, so at the end of this season, the park had announced another expansion. They've done this quite a few times. This time they proposed an 800-seat theatre. Now, as far as I'm aware, although they do have some entertainment venues, I don't think this happened. At least I'm not aware of something of the size that would, you know, cater for 800 people. Now, I could be wrong, and if I am, please let me know, but pretty sure this was a plan that did not happen. Right, speaking of plans that didn't happen, the other thing that they had was they wanted to build a kind of motel-style accommodation. Right now, they obviously have the caravans, they're still there today, but that is their only accommodation. And at this point in 91, they wanted to build this kind of hotel-style thing. The council weren't happy with this though. Not conceptually, they were okay with that. They didn't like the plot of land that they proposed doing it on, so I guess they would have had to move it. And they also didn't like the design. They were like, it's too low and long, like it's a motel. Have you seen a motel? That's what they look like. So in any case, this did not come to fruition. I find this next one a little bit tricky to believe, but apparently some pranksters managed to convince the local media that a school kid had stolen a penguin. Now, I mean, penguins aren't the smallest things. I can't imagine he's just going to pick up a penguin and pick up a penguin. Could have been the chocolate bar. Maybe it was a chocolate bar. But the actual animal, he's not exactly going to shove one of them up his jumper and just leg it out the park, is he? But that made it in the news, so they obviously convinced somebody that it happened. I'm curious about this next one because apparently a group of computer workers tried to set some sort of record by getting on as many rides as they possibly could within 24 hours across various parks. Now, supposedly they were trying to get on 34 different attractions across 6 parks. I'm not entirely sure what the attractions or the parks were. I mean, in my head I'm thinking, you know, you've got Flamingo Land, Lightwater Valley's kind of nearby, and back then probably had a lot more in it. Maybe you could get to Blackpool. So I don't know if this was smaller kind of parks or maybe travelling fairs or something, because I'm trying to work out where they went. Also, the 24 hours thing's a bit strange because, you know, you've got to work within the opening hours of parks, right? Unless they'd kind of worked with the parks to say, can we turn up at 12 o'clock at night and get on some rides, then you're kind of limited by the opening hours and then travelling and stuff. So I don't know what the parks were. I'm curious if you could think of 6 parks that are near Flamingo Land. But yeah, apparently they tried to do that. And then I also found another advert with a really cheesy tune.
All day long, excitement goes on here at Flamingo, land of shows and land of rides. So much to see and do besides. For the best family day out, come to Flamingo, land of thrills and land of fun. Flamingo Land, it's the one.
Right, moving on to 1992, and I said last year that they got the flying carpet 1001 Nights thing, and it didn't last, and it left. Well, they got another ride in this time, which also didn't last, and it was, now I've seen 2 names for this, I've seen Dreamboat and I've seen Spaceboat. Now, I often describe this as a pirate ship that inverts. I'm sure you're going to correct me, because it's probably not that simple, but effectively it looks like a boat, and it's got a cage over it because it does invert, so you get in this, you get strapped in, and it does a full revolution. So, well, they added that, but it didn't last, it disappeared next year. Right, so last year I mentioned the Bullet and how it had a bit of a kind of pushback from the council. You know, you didn't get planning permission, it's too tall, all that kind of stuff. Well, thankfully the decision was overturned and they were allowed to keep it, hence why they didn't make a second park and move it. Now, apparently the bit on top was like a safety device slash flagpole thing, and that was 12 meters, which is huge. The solution that they came up with was to paint it grey. Now, put a pin in that, because that happens again. Clearly the council love grey. Right, a couple of things I found from the TV. First one is a show that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and that is the Chuckle Brothers. Now, there's an episode here where they visit Flamingo Park, and well, one of them wants to go on Bullet, and the other one not so much.
It's very big.
It is very big.
Can we go on it, please?
Well, you can. I've got something else to do.
Like what?
I've got to,
I know, you're scared.
Oh, scared.
You are.
No, I'm not. It's just that I've got to, sort out the rest of the journey.
Oh, all right then.
Well, have a nice time.
Thanks.
Right, if you are enjoying this one, make sure you hit that like button, and if you want to make sure you don't miss the final episodes, hit subscribe. Help this number grow for me. Right, moving on to 1993, it was only a couple of attractions added this time. Now, I mentioned that Dreamboat didn't last very long. Got replaced with a ride known as Skyflyer. Now, I mean, I'm sure it probably isn't, but visually looking at this, I'm like, what's the big difference here? Because this thing, I think it's narrower, so maybe it only took like 2 across instead of like 4 or 5. I'm having a guess here, could be wrong. But basically it's the same sort of idea where it's an enclosed vehicle that kind of does a full revolution. 2 of them though, that kind of went in opposite directions, so visually kind of a bit different. But I don't know why they would replace one with the other. Like, is this a capacity issue? Is it a reliability issue? Was it only a very short-term lease on the first one? Because it seems a little odd to replace this with kind of effectively the same style of ride, or conceptually. You know, as a rider, you'd still have that same sensation of kind of going upside down in revolutions. Anyway, they got that. And then the other one they got was called Tidal Wave. Now, I'm not talking about the boat ride in Thorpe Park. This was it was a Vekoma Waikiki wave ride. And it's kind of a, so if you see it, there's like a row of seats, like on the gondola at the bottom. Sort of facing out the way as if, think of Ripsaw at Towers, right? The Huss Topspin, where there was sort of 2 tiers of seats facing in one direction. It was kind of like that. Looked a bit like a topspin as well, because it had the 2 arms on it. The difference was, instead of the arms kind of moving in unison, they kind of went in opposite directions. So you got this kind of twisting motion. Not too dissimilar to the rack that we had at Camelot, except the seats were facing out the way instead of the rack was kind of facing in the way, and they kind of did this. So anyway, a bit of a unique ride, and well, they had one of those. Right, so we move on to the year of the coaster, 1994. So Blackpool gets the big one, Towers gets Nemesis, Drayton Manor gets Shockwave, Flamingo Land gets Zigzag, a twister. Now, to be fair to them, they have just had a few major installations in the last couple of years, but yeah, they didn't join in the year of the coaster, so that's all they got. Well, it's not actually all they got a few other things as well. They got, now I got confused by this, because I think I said this in the last episode, where I was like, oh, they got a wave swinger, and then I was like, they didn't get a wave swinger, they got sort of chairs, flying chairs. This was when they got the wave swinger, and well, I mean, this is what you would think of as a wave swinger. As far as I can tell, the difference between this and the previous ride was that this one kind of rises up a bit higher when the chairs swing round. But yeah, 1994 is when that happened. Right, now the last attraction I can see in 1994 is a ride, again, that you'll have seen in other parks, called Gravitron. Now, it's one of those rides, it's kind of an encapsulated ride inside. So you go into this thing and you stand around the walls, and basically it spins at a rate of knots and you get pinned to the walls. So there's similar rides like that coming up, but this was the first one. I found reference to yet another expansion plan, which I also don't think came to fruition, because this one said they were going to have a VR centre, they were going to have 10-pin bowling, and they were going to have ice skating. And as far as I'm aware, none of that exists or has existed. If it does or did, then I can't find evidence of it. I'm sure somebody will point me out if I'm wrong. But yeah, they definitely wanted to expand this park. Right, the park got in a little bit of trouble. Well, actually, I say the park. The owner, Mr. Gibb, he got in some trouble for kind of libelous kind of comments. He made some accusations against some animal rights activists, including Joanna Lumley. And then apparently there was a kind of settlement with an undisclosed amount, and his son had to publicly apologise on his behalf. Right, moving on to 1995, we got a couple of attractions. Now, the first one was terrifying, literally. So I'm going to hand back over to Joe because, well, he went on it.
The second one I'm going to share with you is the only ride that's genuinely, and I really literally mean genuinely, scared the absolute living daylights out of me. Now, if you've read my article recently, you'll know what that is. For those of you that don't, it used to be an inverting, I would say gyro swing, it wasn't really. It's a bit of a weird one because it was a big arm And there was obviously a gondola that kind of rotated at the bottom, but it went up with like a big counterweight at the top. And it obviously twisted and went round. Now, the operators of this ran it on different cycles. They ran it on manual cycles, which meant that they could literally do whatever they wanted to do with it. So they could send it up, they could send you around a few times, they could send you up to the top, and they could hold you there. Yeah, needless to say, there's a lot of stories going around about this ride. There's a lot of people that have obviously talked about this obviously being one of probably the most terrifying ride experiences they've ever had. I was genuinely no different, because as I was going up, there was this clunking and this like clanging noise, and it just didn't sound right. And we got up to the top and they held us upside down. It's just gradually going around, and my restraint went and clicked forwards. Now, obviously it wasn't gonna come out, but at that point, me being completely, you know, so I didn't know as much as I did about rides nowadays. I started panicking and screaming and shouting. I thought I was gonna fall out of the ride. I didn't. I made it off safely, obviously, but I never, and I literally mean never ever went back on that ride again. I got one ride on that and that was enough for me. Now, at the time when I rode that, I must have only been about sort of 8 or 9 years old, so I was still quite young. But for someone that age that wasn't too worldly on roller coasters and thrill rides and stuff like that at that point, because we're still talking my earlier days here as well, you know, up till this point I'd only really kind of been to Blackpool Pleasure Beach and obviously like Water Valley and done all those rides and stuff as well. You know, the smaller rides, I mean, obviously Ultimate was different, but up till that point, that's the kind of demographic of ride I'd ridden. So then to go on this and ride that like that and have that actually happen and make those noises, yeah, it really genuinely did actually scare the living daylights out of me. But again, another significant moment for me at Flamingo Land, and certainly one I'll never forget, putting it that way.
The next one we got in 1995 was Flamingo Star. Now, this was a Huss TriStar ride. Now, there's only a couple of these left. I've never experienced one. They don't look particularly special, but I would like to get on one because they are a dying breed. It kind of, I suppose, looks a bit like there's 3 kind of rotating elements in a larger arm that rotates and rises. Kind of feels like a couple of mini Enterprise rides kind of slapped together, spinning around. But, well, they had one called Flamingo Star. Now, I mentioned last year they got Gravitron, that ride where you get pinned against the wall. They got another similar style attraction called UFO. Now, I say similar style because, again, it's kind of a circular thing that you stand against the walls and it spins really fast. The difference with this one is it's outdoors and it kind of raises up to quite a steep angle. Now, I could only find some really blurry photos of this in Flamingo Land, but I did find some footage of a similar ride on the travelling circuit. Now, they got a junior paratrooper ride called the Spotted Cow. There's not much to say about this one because, well, it's themed after some cows, as you can see in this picture. And then unfortunately 1995 was a bit of a devastating year for the park because the owner at the time, Mr. Gibb, he was involved in a car accident. Now, initially he was unconscious. He did regain consciousness and things started to look okay, but unfortunately he went in for some surgery that he required and he passed away. Now, his widow then sued the hospital because she believed that that surgery, there was some neglect. But in any case, as I say, tragic events for the park. And this is when the park was handed over to his son, who still runs it to this day. Right, so 1996 got a very unique style of attraction, right? It was a ride called Top Gun. Now, it's an Intamin flight trainer ride. I'm not sure how many of these existed. I've certainly not seen any before this one. But effectively, these kind of cockpits, if you will, you could kind of rotate them a little bit. Now, it didn't quite go to plan because it was meant to open at the start of the season. It did not. So a lot of people turned up on opening day and were disappointed. So they were given out application forms to apply to get a free ticket to come back later in the season. Now, what I found interesting is I found a story of a guy who joined the RAF and they were amazed by his skills, and he put it down to this ride because apparently he spent 30 hours a week in this ride. Now, not being funny, but at what point does a theme park ride in any way train you to be an RAF pilot? Like, I'm pretty sure this wasn't a fully blown cockpit in there. There was probably 1 or 2 buttons to make it turn. Like, have you seen the inside of a cockpit? Way more complicated. But somehow he attributed his job at the RAF to this ride. Right, if you're similar ages to me or older, you will remember the chain, the high street chain, Woolworths or Woolies. I did find a voucher here where they were doing a partnership with Woolies where you could get buy one, get one free tickets. Now, they also added a show called Sherlock Showtime, and as I'm sure you can imagine, my first thoughts was, oh, Sherlock Holmes, you know, Baker Street and all that. I mean, not quite, because it's kind of like a dog mascot for the park, so yeah, apparently he was called Sherlock. Right, so 1997 saw another coaster added, and it was a Wild Mouse, which very imaginatively, they called Wild Mouse. And I'm kind of disappointed in this one because although there's nothing too special about a wild mouse, this particular one left the park in 2012 to make way for Hero. I'll take the wild mouse, thanks. Right, I've got to give props to the PR team for this one. Apparently, some guy visited the park and he wrote them a letter with some suggestions on how they could improve, right? And they were like greatly appreciative of this, and so they gave the guy a ticket for a free entry to the park. All very good. Thing is, the guy lost the ticket and he found it 24 years later when he was in his 90s. So he called the park and said, will you still honour this? And hats off to them, they let him in 24 years later on that free ticket. Now another thing that if you've seen the other series, this seems to have happened quite a bit. Obviously, It's a Knockout was a fairly popular show of the time, so it wasn't officially It's a Knockout, but there was a charity event in the park themed around It's a Knockout, where I think there was 21 teams and they were raising money for the NSPCC, and the minimum that they had to raise was £500 per team, so it's a decent chunk of change. So another coaster was added in 1998, and this seems to have bounced around so many parks. In fact, I'm going to have to read the list because I will forget. But when it came to Flamingo Land, it was known as the Flying Trapeze. But its history, so it started off in Movie Park, Germany. It then went to Trentham Gardens. It was at Towers, known as the Four-Man Bob. Pleasure Island, moved to Flamingo Land. Then went to Groveland, Loudon Castle up here, and then finally it is currently in Family Park over in France. So there was another attraction that I can see in 1998, and it didn't last very long. It's another one of these ones that was there for one season. What I find a little strange about this one is, on the face of it, this looks like a more involved attraction to construct, right? There are some rides that, you know, they're on the travelling circuit. They take maybe a week to construct and deconstruct, right? Fine. This thing was a kind of para-tower thing, quite a big structure. Now, I believe that it came from Drayton Manor, and then when it left, it went on to Pleasure Island. But as I say, maybe it wasn't that complicated, but it seems like quite a big structure to erect for one season and then take back down. So that one is a little bit of a surprise. And then the last thing I can find from 1998 is another TV appearance, and this time it was a TV show, Heartbeat. Some of you may remember. Now, I can't remember exactly what happened in this one. I think it was called Flamingo Park in this, so kind of obviously this was set back in the 60s, right? So that kind of makes sense. I'm not sure if a reptile escaped or was stolen, because it looks like they're going back to the zoo to return this. But in any case, here's a little clip. And then we round out the 90s with a driving school. Now, again, you'll have seen this in other parks. I think that's sort of the same thing as we've got at Towers behind Hex, different sort of theming, but effectively there was all these different vehicles like a double-decker bus and fire engine, ambulance, all that kind of thing. Definitely on only kids ride, like it's not the sort of thing that a parent's going to get in with their child and drive around because, well, they're tiny and they've only got space for the kid. So they got that at the end of the 90s. Right, there we go. That is the third part, the 90s. There are 2 episodes still to go. So as I mentioned earlier, please do subscribe to be notified when those come out. I will put the rest of them up here. I've been Chris, you've been watching Coaster Dad, and I'll see you in the next episode.